Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. Today is February 21. Today in our Bible reading, we continue to read about some specific instructions being given to the children of Israel, still preparing them for ultimately moving into the promised land. In yesterday's reading and discussion, we talked about the fact that three major feasts were set aside for the children of Israel to commemorate at least 3 times per year, and we talked in some detail about those feasts. Now, what we need to remember about those feasts is that their primary function is for the people to celebrate God, to remember the things God has done for them and continues to do, and to use these occasions as opportunities to say thank you, to express their thanks and their praise to God. We talked yesterday about the Day of Atonement. It is a significant day because it is the one day every year when the high priest, and only the high priest, ultimately goes behind the veil into the Holy of Holies and offers sacrifices on behalf of the sins of the people. That's going to be significant as well much later when Jesus comes to the earth and becomes the ultimate sacrificial Passover lamb, and the veil of the temple is going to be torn. There'll be much more on that later. But for now, let's notice the impact and the seriousness and the specific detail about each of these feasts and celebrations. They are not just a whim from the mind of God, but they all have a special part to play in this story. Now let's remember before we move on today that when we read the Bible, it is one story, and it's kind of like putting together a puzzle. Every one of these pieces that we're looking at sometimes seems kind of confusing in and of itself. Sometimes the detail gets a little laborious and we're not exactly sure what to do with it. But let's keep ourselves in proper perspective, take a step back, and let's see that this is just one small piece of an overall big story. And each piece is important. Just as when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, you don't want to get the whole puzzle put together and then have one piece missing. It may seem like a very insignificant piece in and of itself, but it sure needs to be there, doesn't it, to complete the project. The same is true of each of these daily Bible readings. They are each a piece of a very important story, the big story, God's story that He's introducing and giving to us. Now today, as we go into our readings, we move away from the feasts and the celebrations and start to talk more specifically about offerings, the different kinds of offerings, and 5 different kinds of offerings are going to be listed. Today's reading just looks at the first 2. One of the most significant of the offerings is mentioned first. It is the burnt offering. Now, the burnt offering has some uniqueness to it. It is the only offering that requires there to be a continuous sacrifice of unblemished animals that are going to be completely burned, completely consumed in this sacrifice, and the fire is to never be allowed to go out. The animal is completely consumed. No part of it is eaten by the priests or by the people. And this is described as an aroma to God, an aroma that's pleasing to the Lord. I believe it's this burnt offering to which Paul alludes much later in a very familiar passage in Romans chapter 12, where he challenges Christian people like us to offer our bodies, he says, as living sacrifices. And I believe the idea is that Paul is using this imagery of the burnt offering, that you and I as Christians, even today, are to crawl up on that altar and give our lives so that we are completely consumed. There is nothing left over, and the fire within us never goes out. Some very powerful symbolism. Every time I think about that passage, I'm reminded of something I read long ago when one author said, the problem with living sacrifices is they keep crawling off the altar. That's something it's easy for us to do. It's easy for us to talk big, isn't it? To say, this is the kind of dedication I'm going to give God. This is the kind of commitment I'm going to make. And yet when the going gets tough, we sometimes just sort of ease our way off of the altar and cease to be a committed or a dedicated people. That burnt offering is very important. The fire is kept burning. It's a regular burnt offering that was instituted way back at Mount Sinai as a pleasing aroma to God. And it must be required, it is required to be offered at the tabernacle setting. There is an altar there for burnt offerings. The next offering we read about is called the cereal offering, sometimes referred to as a grain offering. This offering is more of an expression of devotion. Whereas the feasts were celebrations and remembering and praise given to God, the offerings are more looking within the giver, the worshiper. They are offerings so that our guilt can be removed, which is a fancy Bible word, expiation, and we can obtain God's favor, propitiation. Now, those are big Bible words, but that's the whole point of offerings, to make an appeal to God, to take care of our, not just our sin, but our guilt from that sin, and to once again find God's favor. These cereal offerings or grain offerings are to bring special blessing to the entire crop from which they come, so that the crops can be an aroma pleasing to the Lord as this cereal offering is made. We are told in this section about the importance of holiness, and once again, that things are holy when they are given to God and dedicated to God, and whatever touches the holy thing also becomes holy. And it is an aroma, too, that is pleasing to the Lord. The question I want to close with today is this: what kind of offerings are we making in our daily life? Now, we're not building altars physically anymore. We're not offering animal sacrifices anymore. But what are we doing in our lives to commemorate the fact that not only are we grateful to God and honoring Him and praising Him, but we're constantly pouring ourselves out before Him, offering to Him our very selves, offering to Him our heart, and staying dedicated, making sure we're completely consumed by His love, completely consumed by His will, and never allowing that fire of His Holy Spirit within us to go out. What are we doing to make sure that we are a pleasing aroma to God? We are, Paul says much later in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, the aroma of Christ, the fragrance of Christ. Let me ask you a question as we close today. When you enter a room or you come into a particular circumstance, do you so represent the aroma of Christ that people notice? They notice something is different, and they feel and sense the presence of Jesus Himself. These offerings are important. These offerings are an appeal to God for a clear conscience and a commitment to God to be His people no matter what happens in our lives. Isn't it great to be a lamplighter? His word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. I hope you have a blessed day.